Thank you so much, Martel, and I'm sorry about the internet connectivity issues. Again, I am Kristen Sarver. I work at the Utah Criminal Justice Center, which is a collaborative research institute that partners the College of Law, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and the College of Social Work. In my time at the Utah Criminal Justice Center, I have done several projects on reentry, qualitative and quantitative. So today I'm going to be talking sort of broadly about a couple of those projects and then the topic of reentry in general. I do want to say as I start this, it is very hard to get up and get ready for an event when you are alone in your house and you never leave your house. So I want to acknowledge to everyone whose presentations I've attended that this is the first time I've done one where I'm alone in my house and speaking to myself in a screen. So anyway, thank you all for coming. Let's see, why is this not going? Okay. So when you talk about reentry, I think I want to give a little background. The first thing to think about is really the purpose of the criminal justice system. And in the United States, thank you, Robin. In the United States, the criminal justice system has sort of four things that it does. One of those is purely symbolic, if that's the way to talk about it, which is this idea of retribution, that if people commit a crime and cause harm, that there should be some punishment. It's not necessarily intended for any other purpose other than to sort of redress harm. The other three functions of the criminal justice system are really intended to prevent crime in some capacity. So one of them is incapacitation. Obviously, if you put someone in prison or jail, they can't commit more crimes, right? Deterrence is another one, and the function of deterrence is the idea that punishment serves not just a retributive purpose, but that it also prevents people from committing crimes. So if people are, deterrence sort of assumes that there's this rational decision-making process around crime, and that if you ratchet up the consequences, people will do this sort of cost-benefit analysis and decide not to commit crime, and or people who have experience in the criminal justice system as a result of being incarcerated or punished will choose not to commit crime in the future. And then there's a rehabilitative function, right, which would basically say that the purpose of the criminal justice system is to really identify kind of what factors are contributing to criminal behavior and address those factors so that the person, you rehabilitate them and they are no longer likely to commit crimes. So in the United States, what you see is between 1970 and 1990, you saw this real sort of fatalism in terms of of rehabilitation. Very famous study called the Martinson study came out in 1974, which basically said that treatment does not work at all. And with that, you saw this shift to this deterrence and incapacitation model in terms of criminal justice system. So what you see in there is this emphasis on mandatory minimums and truth in sentencing, right? So if someone's sentenced to 5 years, they stay in prison for 5 years. You don't let them out early for good behavior or for completing rehabilitative programs. You saw, again, this very big emphasis on punishment as prevention. So 3 strikes legislation, where you would essentially say, even if someone is committing low-level crimes, the accumulative low-level crimes ultimately result in the determination that someone is a serious offender, and so they would get a very harsh punishment for the 3rd iteration, even of a low-level crime. You saw in this time period really the elimination of discretionary parole. So what that means is typically if someone goes to prison, when they come out, they may come out on supervision of the criminal justice system. In its early iteration, parole supervision was really designed to help folks reintegrate into the community. It was also designed to incentivize good behavior during incarceration, because if people behaved well, they could get out early onto discretionary parole. You also see sort of in the 90s, this focus on risk management. So seeing folks who are coming out of prison really in terms of their risk to the community. And you see some shift in the purpose of parole, not focusing so much on reintegration of people exiting prisons, but really a focus on protecting the community from this threat that the person exiting prison poses to the community. So as a result of all of these changes, you see here, and I'm sure many of you have seen figures like this before, but you see this huge increase in the incarcerated population in the United States. And in these bars, what you're seeing here is the gold bar is the total population under correctional supervision. The gray bar is the incarcerated population. And then this green bar is those on community supervision. So still under the control of the criminal justice system, but in the community. And you can see here that this is about a, oh my gosh, my math is going to be bad, twofold, threefold, somefold increase. Let's go with somefold increase in community supervision. And you also see this concurrent sort of vast expansion in terms of the number of resources that are spent on the correctional system. So during this course of time, you see an over 300% increase in the amount of money spent on the criminal justice system. So not surprisingly, if you put that many people in prison, you have a lot of people coming out of prison. More than 95% of individuals in state prisons will eventually return to the community. And what we know about prison is that not only does it not serve a public service in terms of rehabilitating folks if you don't focus on rehabilitation, but it can actually increase the chances that it can make someone more criminogenic. In terms of this presentation today, I'm really going to be focusing on reentry from state and federal prisons. So the process of reentry in this definition that I'm using is the process of leaving prison and returning to society, focusing on individuals who have been convicted of the most serious offenses, who have been removed from communities for longer periods of time, and who are managed by state correctional and parole systems here. So when you're talking folks in prison, you're talking sentenced individuals who are typically in prison for at a minimum of a year and oftentimes much longer than a year. So essentially this problem of reentry was created, right, by the fact that we locked so many people up. If we're not providing services, right, we're increasing their risk and then they're coming out. The reentry process research has looked at a couple different things that shape it. One is state and correctional policy and practice. We'll be talking about that a little bit in the upcoming slides. Another one is the collateral impacts of incarceration. So another focus of this punitive orientation to crime is to punish people with a criminal record in terms of their access to public benefits, in terms of their ability to obtain jobs or be in certain professions. So you see a lot of kind of policy-based impacts related to having a criminal record. And you also, I would argue, see a lot of stigma that isn't codified in policy, but is kind of a resistance to hiring associating with living next to people with a criminal record. And then you also see individual characteristics really influencing. So we'll get into that a little bit, but what I mean by that is individuals in terms of employment, education, social support. Today, we're going to be focusing, because of the studies that I'll be talking about, we're going to be focusing more on individual characteristics and state correctional policy and practice. I do want to highlight that a lot of these collateral impacts, however, have a big impact on folks' ability to reintegrate successfully. So one example that I want to give when you talk about this move toward a punitive orientation to the criminal justice system is you saw the creation of this supervision model called intensive supervision. And with that, you saw, again, parole practice, which is individuals being supervised in the community after a period of incarceration. This move from social work to law enforcement. So in its early iteration, parole practice really was done by social workers and really focused on kind of providing services and identifying the causes of criminal behavior and treating them. And you saw this move to a more monitoring, surveilling interaction where a lot of the activity is meeting with folks and making sure that they're complying with the conditions of supervision, which are rules that someone has to follow while they're on supervision. The conditions of supervision may criminalize behavior that for someone else would not be criminal. For example, typically people on supervision can't consume alcohol. So again, you have in those laws some legal behaviors that become illegal because the person is on supervision. Again, you see this shift from assistance to monitoring. So unexpected visits to someone's house to make sure there's nothing illegal going on. again, the interaction between agents and individuals is very focused on compliance with the rules. As I mentioned earlier, see the shift from community integration to community protection. So the role of the agent shifts substantially and becomes kind of a person whose job it is to protect the community versus a person whose job it is to kind of focus on reintegrating the individual. And you see that folks start being reincarcerated for new crimes, not only new crimes, but also for these technical violations. So that is a violation of those conditions of supervision rather than a violation of a law, rather than a new crime specifically. And between 1978 and about 1990, folks had an 87% increased chance of being returned to prison for a technical violation, right? So you see this vast change in terms of how and why people are going to prison. And you see that parole becomes one of the main ways in which we are reincarcerating folks. So that the system becomes one of the main things that is returning people to prison. Here's an example of that. The top figure here is looking, this isn't all of the United States, it's about 40 states. This is a Pew Research study, but you see in 1999, when you look at the folks released from prison, 20% within 3 years were returned for a new crime, 25% were returned for a technical violation, and 55% didn't return at all. In 2004, you see those numbers look similar. 22% were returned for a new crime, 21% for a technical violation, and 57% did not return. I put the Utah figures on here because in 1999, Utah actually had the highest rate of returning individuals to prison for technical violations of any state in the country. So you can see here, 51% of individuals in Utah in 1999 were returned for a technical violation, compared to 15% for a new crime. Those numbers look somewhat better in 2004, 21% versus 32%. And if you look at the last 7 years, you will see some downward trend in terms of these figures. But what I think is important to point out here is these figures are for return to prison. What you see are the highest failure rates are in that first year after release. The longer someone stays out, the more likely they are to stay out, to continue to stay out. You also see, if you look at figures such as rearrest versus reincarceration, so the numbers look different depending on how you're defining recidivism. But if you look at rearrest rates, you see about 75% of people released from prison will return within 5 years of being released. So again, very, very high rates of return. Unfortunately, intensive supervision doesn't necessarily address that problem for one reason. Obviously, you're picking people up. If you're monitoring them more closely, you are more likely to detect technical violations and new crimes. But you also see that once individuals leave intensive supervision, they're not less likely to return to prison than someone who wasn't on intensive supervision. So you have this kind of big intervention that puts more resources towards someone, but doesn't necessarily result in improved outcomes in the long term. So this problem with reentry really stems, is an unintended consequence of sentencing reform, partially because of the impact of incarceration on long-term offending trajectories, right? So when we put people in prison for a long time, when we put them in prison repeatedly, we are continuing to disrupt those things that make folks less criminogenic, such as community ties, social relationships, and employment. And problems in those areas are all associated with high rates of reincarceration. In one study that UC-JC did, we had a substantial number of the individuals in the study. So we were interviewing people who had left prison on parole, and a substantial number of them were incarcerated at the age of 18 and were incarcerated for 3 to 5 years. And I think you see in that, right, that what most of us are doing between the ages of 18 and 25 sets us up for the rest of our life in a particular way. And if you are spending that time in prison and or on parole and struggling to kind of regain some of these community ties, social relationships, and employment, you are setting someone up for long-term problems with recidivism. So when you look at the research around reentry, so there's a lot of quantitative research. I wanted to talk today a little bit about former inmates' experience of reentry, because that tends not to be something that is included in policy to the degree that maybe it should be if we want our interventions to be more effective. In interviews done, the Urban Institute did a long-term series of projects looking at the experience of individuals as they exited prison. JC has also done a couple of those. But what you see with substance abuse is that the majority of folks coming out really, really struggle to maintain sobriety and not relapse once they're released, lacking pro-social supports to support them in that, lacking access to treatment. And we know that substance abuse treatment needs to continue in the community in order for the person to sort of practice those relapse prevention and refusal skills. So if we treat someone in prison and don't support them as they're released, we're really increasing the chances, right, that they're going to be part of that failure that happens pretty quickly once someone is released. Many folks coming out of prison had no prior stable employment experience and struggle very much, both in terms of their employment history, their employment skills, but also with folks' willingness to hire someone with a criminal history. And the fact that we tend to focus a lot when folks are making hiring decisions, we focus a lot on kind of the offense type or the time since the offense versus kind of actual risk of recidivism, which can be assessed. You saw a lot of the individuals in the Urban Institute study really, really struggling to have stable employment. So they would have 3 different jobs that they were juggling, and or they had employment that's kind of inherently unstable, like temp work and or construction work. For someone on supervision, construction work can be hard because you often have restrictions around travel. Social support, no surprise, most people coming out of prison have done things that have caused a lot of stress with their family members, so they may struggle with that. A lot of folks in prison are in a prison that is not anywhere near their family, so it's hard to kind of maintain those relationships while someone is in prison. And also for a lot of people, their pre-prison relationships were part of how they got into crime, that sort of crime itself was the activity that solidified those relationships. And so those relationships may be ones that are risky to return to, but without those, there's this sort of isolation. And again, I think you start to see there the impact of stigma and kind of how we think about people with a criminal history, and how we tend to think of them as sort of different from people without a criminal history. So folks don't want someone with a criminal history, again, living next door to them, dating their daughter, whatever those things are. Housing, the vast majority of folks coming out of prison don't have a place to live as they're coming out. In Utah, typically that means you would go to a halfway house until a stable housing placement is found. That halfway house, however, may not be in the community that you're hoping to reside in. So again, you see some problem there that if you're working to get a job and make relationships in one community, but you're hoping to go to a different community, there's another disruption of those community ties. Most inmates coming out of prison don't have access to health insurance, so mental and physical health. Even if those needs were met in prison, that becomes less secure as the person leaves prison. And then you really see these fragmented systems and services, right, where someone is sort of released from prison and is expected to kind of on their own figure out all these aspects, may or may not have a phone, may or may not have access to transportation, and may or may not have access to support services and assistance. So a couple quotes I wanted to put up here that you also see with folks coming out of prison is that prison is very much kind of positioned, I think, in our public narratives as a turning point. So as this place where someone makes the decision not to offend anymore. And so what you see in a lot of studies is that folks really struggle kind of going back and forth between this idea of prison as a place where they've become different, where they've changed, and also a lot of concern and anxiety about what it's going to be like when they're released, that the world has changed so much that they won't be accepted, that they won't be able to reintegrate, particularly with people who've spent lots of time in prison. You really see some of that anxiety about like, how is this going to go? You also see some wariness around the relationship to the parole agents. So even folks who have had positive experience or who are hopeful about that, can experience a lot of anxiety that this person may or may not be on their side, may or may not be sending them back to prison for legitimate reasons. So this is a quote from an individual that we interviewed for one of our studies at UCJC. This person was on parole, had committed a violation, but their agent had decided to leave them in the community and send them to substance abuse treatment. This person says, the primary thing that would send me back is a relapse. If I start lying to my parole officer, not paying my fines and fees, I'm worried what would happen if I lose my girl. And I use this quote because I think what you see here is even in someone who's pretty committed to change, this anxiety and lack of confidence in their ability to do that. And that there's this pretty sensitive thing that sort of, as long as this relationship is in place, that things are okay, but there's this fragility about the change process. So you can imagine that if you only have this one relationship that's your support, that person is in a pretty vulnerable place in terms of potentially returning to prison. This is another individual who had been reincarcerated after a violation, after a parole lease. This person had been in and out of prison. He was actually in his 30s, but his entire life. And I think you see here, I am trying to be the mighty salmon and swim upstream, but I asked myself, why wouldn't I do that? In this case, he meant sell drugs again. I have done it repeatedly for years. And I think this quote I put up there because I think it's important to really consider that for folks who have repeated or lengthy periods of incarceration, there may not be any experience of success in the community that isn't, for example, selling drugs. And so I think it's really, really hard to expect someone who's never sort of functioned, never been integrated in some way, to come out of a period of incarceration and suddenly, in the absence of financial, social support and treatment, be able to do that. So when you look at studies of reentry programs, what you see is that essentially what you see is there's a lot of research saying there are a lot of promising practices, there's a lot of research saying there are a lot of unpromising practices, and there is very little research that tells us specifically what we need to do to help someone reintegrate successfully. The one thing that we have started to know is that this idea that you can just have this kind of standalone program that just targets the person at one point in time is unrealistic, that you really need to think about spanning the phase from incarceration through release. So prior to release, you're preparing someone, you're making connections to outside resources, you're getting treatment, that you're supporting them during release, and that you're continuing to provide some services to the point of reintegration. Reentry programs typically target employment, housing, substance abuse, and education. When you look at the research on those programs, again, there's strong research around substance abuse treatment and particularly therapeutic communities. There is mixed research in terms of education. There's a lot of support for post-secondary education, less support for GED and TABE. And that doesn't mean it's not effective. That means there's just not that much research around it. And some of the research is not high quality enough to really tell us what we need to know. And employment also, there are mixed studies, some that say you can reduce recidivism by targeting employment, some that don't show that. I think the take-home message from this is that really treatment programs need to be multi-target, right? So you need to address not just a single factor that's causing the person to engage in crime, but you need to kind of treat the holistic person and address all of those concerns. What you see in the research on these reentry programs, some of the big one there is I'm going to forget the acronym, SVORI, Serious and Violent Offender Reentry Initiative, was a federal one that started in 2003. There's also the Second Chance Act, which is a more recent iteration providing services to support reentry. For the SVORI study in particular, you saw an increased receipt of services. So you did see people get more housing, more employment, and more treatment. In the SVORI program, that wasn't associated with reductions in recidivism. So what that's telling us, right, is there's something else going on, that the intervention, either as it's applied or as it's meeting that person's need, isn't working. What follow-up research showed for that one is that while services started in prison, for the most part, people didn't continue to get services or act services after they were released, even though that was a target of the program. And you also saw that there wasn't necessarily a good match between assessed needs and the services provided. So the program was designed with this kind of hypothetical inmate in mind, but the services couldn't be individualized for someone's specific needs. So again, what you see there is we know that services can work, but we don't have clear evidence on exactly how to make that happen. So one thing we do know, however, if you back away from specific programs and interventions, many of you are probably familiar with this idea of evidence-based correctional practice, sometimes called the risk-need responsivity method. Sorry, I'm checking my time because I'm notorious for talking too long. I want to make sure I get to the end. That the evidence for this, an intervention that follows these principles. So it's not specifically the intervention, it's following specific principles, which is to say that you do a risk assessment and you target people who are highest risk of recidivism. Because we know if we provide too many services to people who are low risk, at best, will have no impact, but at worst, we can actually increase their chances of recidivism. That you want to target criminogenic needs, and those are needs that are statistically associated with recidivism. So those 8 needs include antisocial personality pattern, antisocial behaviors, antisocial attitudes, problems with leisure, problems with family relationships, antisocial peers, and substance abuse, sorry. And so I think in this model, what you see is some of the needs that we provide to folks. So I'm going to come back up here in terms of housing, for example, are an essential need in terms of stabilizing that person, but provide in and of themselves, they don't necessarily reduce recidivism, right? So they allow someone to engage in treatment, they help someone stay out of kind of risky situations and that kind of chaos. But if someone is high risk, you also need to target these other 8 needs. And then responsivity is really focused on how you provide services. And what that says is you really want to focus on cognitive, behavioral, and social learning models. What you see with research looking at this type of correctional intervention is that you can reduce recidivism by up to 35% if you have programs who address all of these 3 principles. You also see when you talk about recidivism, as I mentioned, therapeutic communities that target substance abuse are one of the most effective things in terms of reducing post-prison recidivism. Most of that research has been done on in-prison therapeutic communities. More recently, we've started looking at therapeutic communities as a form of reentry. And you can see numbers drop by about half in terms of recidivism. You see more impact if these therapeutic communities start in prison and then transition to a community-based therapeutic community. Cognitive behavioral modalities, so that would be structured learning that really targets antisocial thinking, problems in thinking, and also has a behavioral piece that's really focused on shaping behavior, can have an impact on recidivism for both adults and juveniles. You also see, specifically for drug-using offenders, that medication-assisted treatment can reduce relapse and in that way also reduce recidivism. And then in-reach programming, and what that means is basically programming is where you have a continuum of care between the prison setting through the reentry part and then into the community. So you have the same kind of entity providing services throughout that time. So in the current study, the current study is really based on these 2 slides, right? So trying to design an intervention that follows evidence-based correctional practice that relies on interventions that have evidence for specifically reducing recidivism. And the study was planned by both correctional and treatment folks. So it was really designed to kind of integrate those 2 voices. The study also happened at a time when Utah had adopted the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which meant that Utah had changed to some degree the way that we do parole practice, and specifically had changed the reasons that folks are returned to prison while on parole, hoping to reduce those kind of cycling people in and out of the system. So the study itself was a randomized control trial, an intent to treat analysis. So what that means is folks were offered the option to participate in the treatment intervention. If they chose not to, they continued to be in the sample, even if they didn't get treatment. And the point of that was really to kind of say, this is how the system exists right now in Utah, and we don't want to create some kind of false way for people to get this treatment that wouldn't actually be what happens if they are in prison in general. The target population were male inmates released to parole with co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. And we targeted this population because you will see that everything I've talked about in terms of reentry is more, the simplest way to say that is more for folks who have co-occurring substance abuse and mental health disorders. About 2.5% of the US population has a co-occurring disorder. About 42% of inmates in state prisons do. A huge chunk, 80% of inmates entering substance abuse treatment also have a mental health disorder. And what you see is these folks have even more problems in terms of housing, employment, and also family and social support, right? So you see an increased risk for folks with those disorders. In terms of the intervention itself, so the program adhered to those R&R principles. Folks were sent into the program based on assessed risk and need. There was the intent to provide group-based substance abuse treatment in prison, medication-assisted treatment before and after release where needed, a therapeutic community, cognitive behavioral interventions, and employment supports. And there were some problems with implementation here that I'm going to talk about at the end. But so this was ideally what was going to happen. In some cases it did, but it was hard to do. There were also a real target on increasing treatment engagement. So with that, doing motivational interviewing, doing this in-reach piece, providing some housing support and residential services, and providing integrated mental health services, right? So all of these things are things we know that put people at risk of dropping out, specifically folks in the correctional system, of dropping out of treatment, which obviously makes treatment less effective. So what we saw is there were 77 people enrolled in the study. There were 39 in the control group and 38 in the treatment group. They were about 37.6 years old, about 35% were non-white. The risk level, so this was assessed on the LSR&R, which is a standardized risk assessment used commonly in the United States that has a lot of research supporting its efficacy in predicting recidivism and identifying needs for male offenders. You see that it was a very intense group in terms of risk level, with more than half of them being assessed as intensive risk, and then also high risk. In terms of substance abuse treatment, using the ASAM, the vast majority of them were assessed as needing intensive outpatient treatment, and then the majority of them were property offenders. These were all men as well, and what we know in terms of reentry is that younger men who are property offenders are the highest risk for returning to prison. So here's basics in terms of the recidivism rate. Again, sorry, I want to make sure I'm not talking too much. And what you see here, I think, is that out of the 39 in the control group and the 33 in the treatment group, the vast majority are returning to prison for some reason. Again, mostly for a parole violation, some for a new charge. In terms of recidivism, what we found when we looked at long-term recidivism, so some folks in the study had up to 2 years of follow time, we didn't see a difference between the treatment and control group. Some part of that is likely a function of the fact that only half of the treatment group actually received the treatment. But I think what this slide shows you is if you look at the point at which 50% of the sample has returned to prison, for this group right here, which is the control group, that happens at about 150 days. And for this group, it hasn't happened yet at 200 days. Where you see these two groups start to look similar is post about 217 days, which in this case is when folks have really stepped down from that formal structured treatment. So you see that in the short term, you really were able to shape the offending trajectory, which, given research I discussed earlier, that the longer you can keep someone from returning to prison, the more likely they are to succeed, is an important finding. We were also interested in the receipt of substance abuse and mental health services. One thing, I'll come back to this. What you see here basically is that the control group returns to prison at a rate that's about 1.8 times the rate of the treatment group. What you see here is for each quarter, the receipt of services. These are services provided through Medicaid. We found in this study that Medicaid expansion, which ideally helps increase access to services, was also somewhat made it difficult for us to track receipt of services because Medicaid data, we couldn't get identified Medicaid data. So we had state data, we had corrections data, but those two data sets didn't match. And we had Medicaid data, but it wasn't identified, so we couldn't see how it matched with other. For that reason, because we felt like the Medicaid data was the most reliable and had the most number of people in it with treatment, we used that. And what you see here, this number, for example, of 4.4 is telling you that in Q1, the treatment sample received an average of 4.14 services per person, substance abuse services, while the control group received about 0.34, so 1/3 of a service per person. I think the main thing to see here is just when you look at this control group, how little of them were receiving substance abuse services. The treatment group was receiving substantially more and significantly more in our analysis. When we looked at mental health services, though, very few individuals in either group had recorded mental health services, and there was no significant difference in the provision of mental health services to one group versus the other. So a couple conclusions around this. One is a lot of people return to prison. I think another important thing to talk about, though, is that treatment did have a short-term impact on recidivism, and specifically, it seems like there's something happening at the point where folks step down from a very structured intervention to a less structured intervention that provides insight into ways to maybe think about altering the intervention to make it even more successful. Very few individuals got treatment in close proximity to release. Very few got any mental health services, and there are some problems in studying this in terms of the availability of treatment data. So when you talk about kind of this program in general, I think one thing that's a big thing is the refusal to participate. As I mentioned, only half of the folks offered treatment participated in it. There were also some substantial barriers to providing interventions in prison. So because of security classification and the design of the prison, it was very, very difficult to provide group-based interventions. So very few of the folks actually got that, and that was a core portion of the intervention, was really to kind of support the development of this kind of treatment community that would support each other during the transition through release. Also, in terms of dosage, initially, the idea was that the in-portion part of the treatment would be about 8 weeks. Because of difficulties identifying a population and because of other reentry services that were happening in the prison, that ended up getting dropped to about 2 weeks. So again, the dosage there was of concern. And then also the length of structured services. Again, I think the other research suggests maybe you would want that to be longer. In terms of this program, recommendations would be to really, one thing you could do in terms of addressing this refusal to participate would be incentivize participation by offering early release for those individuals who agree to enter the program as a condition of release, so they would get out early. Particularly when looking with individuals with a co-occurring disorder, what we know is those folks tend to not do well in prison, have behavioral issues. And in some cases, they couldn't participate in the intervention because their behavior had gotten them put into a unit wherein they were not accessible to the treatment team. So that might be a particular group that you would target to have out of prison and on parole in this program. You could also incentivize participation as formal aftercare for inmates exiting prison-based therapeutic communities. So again, create that transition, and we know that that's a more effective way to provide treatment. Integrate into existing reentry planning, and also potentially creating a structured aftercare for this program itself, which did not exist. Another suggestion would be to implement the program in parole violator units, which have less restrictions in terms of how you provide services, and specifically target individuals who have returned to prison. So when I talked earlier about people think of kind of this turning point in prison, that often ends up being kind of a failed turning point, that maybe that experience of being returned to prison would make people more open to participating in treatment. Another thing would be selecting a single housing unit to which all participants would be transferred for the duration of program. So again, you could really develop those relationships and skills and provide treatment prior to release. Broadly, I think, and this will be my last slide, so I will take questions. What we know from this research is that access to treatment is limited. Some of you may have seen the audit that just came out from the Utah legislative audit talking about since JRI access to treatment for justice-involved persons, and while it's increased, it's still limited, and there's still many problems with folks getting that treatment. We didn't in this study at all talk about interventions to address collateral consequences. I would argue we weren't able to look at that, but that has to be something. Having policy discussions around turning individuals to prison for technical violations. So you can see that even with the JRI implementation, folks were getting returned for technical violations at a pretty high rate. And then we also found that it was difficult to specifically target persons with a mental illness in prison, because at the time that this study was done, there wasn't a systematic screening process to identify mental health issues. So that trying to, again, get a handle on that earlier. Here is both my contact information and the Utah Criminal Justice Center's website. I'm going to stop my sharing now so you can ask questions. Can you spell out the acronym again? Yes, for the study on reentry programming. It's SV as in Victor, ORI. Is the reduction in recidivism for people who participate in therapeutic communities for substance abuse primarily for people who are incarcerated for substance abuse related charges, or does it also to apply? So the research, so what the research would tell you is that if you're targeting someone for substance abuse treatment in prison, you want it to be related to an assessed need, whether or not the offense that got them in prison had anything to do with substance abuse. And I think because of all the ways that the criminal justice system negotiates charges for someone, the offense type isn't necessarily a good indicator. And as you saw in our study, most people were property crimes that may be substance abuse related, but didn't necessarily have that kind of charge. What is a property offense? So a property offense would be theft, breaking and entering, stealing, so harming, taking someone's property. It's a good question why those folks are the most high risk of recidivism. In terms of age, we can't really explain it. We know there is some sort of normative curve for antisocial behavior for adolescents as they enter adulthood, and particularly for males. That's been replicated again and again. I think one thing we know about that is that there's sort of this normative development of behaviors that in the absence of an intervention goes away. And as a criminal justice system, we are often kind of picking people up at that point and incarcerating them at a point where maybe they would just on their own stop committing crimes. What would be the recommended amount of intervention dosage time or hours for clients that are high risk and high need? So the dosage question is a great question. And we don't have a full answer on that. People have started studying that more regularly. What you will see as a suggestion is that you want high risk offenders to be kind of somewhere between 200 to 300 hours, and that those lower risk offenders, you're looking at maybe 150 to 200, 100 to 200 hours. There is a study by Sperber, S-P-E-R-B-E-R, 2017, that has a really good discussion of this question of dosage. But there isn't a hard answer to that question, if that makes sense. So I think the higher risk, the more hours people should get, and the more treatment targets they should be, more needs should be targeted. I apologize. Interventions which are culturally appropriate. In other words, if a reentry, so this question is, what is the research saying about interventions that are culturally appropriate? In other words, if a reentry intervention program considers cultural issues in community reentry, is there any literature that shows this to be more effective at reducing recidivism? That is a great question, and I don't think we know enough about that. There are some folks, Faye Taxman is one who has really started talking about in what ways are we maybe criminalizing or seeing as risky behaviors that are culturally normative. And we have not done enough to study that. I don't know of any specific reentry programs that have a ton of research that address that. So we should be doing that, and we're not doing that, I think, in terms of culturally relevant reentry programs. I think in general, also our reentry programs have focused on programs designed for men based on research We know that there's some differences in gender too, in terms of what might be an effective intervention. So those are important points. In Utah, do you see or know of any efforts to use elements of restorative justice in supporting individuals as they re-enter our communities or in treatment? So I have seen that more with juveniles. With the current JRI legislation, there's been some effort to kind of have schools using restorative justice instead of referring kids to the courts. I have heard some openness in our correctional partners to try that. It isn't that I know of right now in the adult system being implemented in any big way. I think a limitation to the research we currently have, right, is that we're focusing just on recidivism, right? That's the behavior of interest because we're interested in protecting the community. What I like about restorative justice is there's this focus on reintegration, right? That you're not just isolating this one behavior that worries you, but you're really saying this is a person and we need to kind of focus on how we help this person address the harm that was caused and get them back into the community in a way where the community also accepts them. I know that there was one study in Utah, a domestic violence study that looked at a restorative justice intervention to reduce future recidivism, but that's the only one that I've heard of. Other questions?
Christian, we had a couple questions come through the chat that I can read to you.
Sure.
One question is, what role did evidence play in the shift in approach here?
So great question. In terms of the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, it played a huge role. So the state of Utah commissioned several different research partners, Pew being one, the Council on State Governments being one, UCJC did some work on it to really look at how does what is currently happening in Utah, and how does that map onto what the research tells us is a more effective way to reduce both costs, reduce recidivism, and increase treatment. So it was a huge part of those shifts.
Great, and then there's one more question for our guests that are seeking CEUs. One of the quiz questions asks, on average, what portion of prisoners are re-incarcerated within 3 years after release from prison? And I think we're just hoping to get a clarification on that number.
Sorry. Yeah, so there's a range of numbers. I need to, Emily, can I go back in and look at what figures I used for the question and send that to you, and you can send it out to everyone?
Sure, yeah. Right now the options that we have are 45%, 66%, and 80%. So we can go in and correct those if needed.
So it would be 66%. So for returns to prison, it's about 2/3, so 66%. Thank you, I apologize. I sent the questions in and then I pulled different research.
Great, thank you for clarifying. We have about 5 more minutes for questions if anyone has any other questions to send in.
Yes, yeah, I agree. So there's a comment about the very sad information. I mean, I think the good information in it is that Utah, because of JRI, really has been making good changes. I think the audit that just came out last week is really focused on like part of JRI was to fully kind of scale up reentry services, and that hasn't happened yet. So I think hopefully with that report, you will see more resources put towards that. And I think, again, continuing to study and identify those programs which work is an important part of that as well. Thank you all for coming. I know we have 6 minutes left. I know I'm often happy when I have more time in my day, but I want to, if there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer. Yes, so yes, email it here. I'll put my email address in the chat right now. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. Here, let's see. That's my email. And again, thanks to you all for attending.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarver, for your excellent presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Apologies for our little technical difficulties at the beginning there. We hope you'll join us for our next Quarant Talks with Teasley event, which you can actually find the information about in the link that's in the chat box right now. That will be on November 18th, and it will feature Dr. Adam Hanley. So we hope you'll all be able to join us then again, and thank you all for coming today. Thanks again, Christian, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thank you.